Good. Hello everyone and welcome to today's SEEP meeting. Before we get to main items, do we have any apologies for absence?
Chair, I've not had any apologies, but I understand either Councillor Pato is joining us later or is absent.
Thank you. And are there any declarations of interest?
Other than living on the planet.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's just a given. Yeah, well, okay, and can we approve the accuracy of the minutes of our last meeting, which was 18th of July this year? Okay with that? Yeah. In which case, the first main item, Norwich Climate Commission Progress Report and Future Plans. Really pleased to have Asher Minns with us. Finally, I know you were due here in February, but we had some illness going on. So I'll hand over you to, you've got a presentation and then for questions.
Yeah, sure, and I'll use a mic, shall I? Well, thank you everybody, and good afternoon. So, yes, exactly that. I think we were COVIDed in February, and so I decided the best thing to do was not to turn up. And so we held it over. So this is a slightly updated version. I will speak for kind of however long you like, but maybe 10 minutes or something, and then we'll see where we're at. But hopefully we can have more of a discussion than me just pronouncing forth from my slides, because I think there's probably quite a lot to talk about that isn't necessarily on these slides. And, well, who am I? So I don't know everybody, actually, which is quite nice. I'm the Executive Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is up here at the University of East Anglia on the Hill. And as part of that work, it would be about 2 years ago, well, it was November 2021, so it's during the Glasgow COP that we sort of announced the Climate Commission, so some work had gone in before that. And the purpose of the Commission is to do lots of things. It's to be a friend to help the City Council on its missions around climate and environment and sustainability. It's to support citizens in their journey and their pathways. And it's to apply theory to practice as well, because within the Tyndall Centre, which is now 23 years old, we're a partnership of 4 UK universities. We've been researching what to do about climate change all that time. And so also it's about applying theory to practice, you know, what we know out of academia into the place where we live, to be a place-based action. And we are also part of, there's a national network called the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which is climate commissions around the country, and we're a member of that as well. So we not only are working here, we're feeding out into the wider community and vice versa. So the Climate Commission, and what we're doing here really is I'm just sort of presenting what we are and some of our highlights. We probably started for proper at the beginning of 2022, having started for the Glasgow Climate Summit in November 2021. Not going to go through everybody, but these are various members at various times. We're a little bit flexible. Some people, you know, life changes for people, they have babies maybe and go and do other things, or our youth commissioners go off to university, that sort of thing. So we do move around a bit, but this on the column on the left, the main block is probably our core members at the moment, and we've expanded out into a few new members as well. And Emma, of course, is one of the co-chairs as well. So we've got architects, people in Norfolk County Council, people specialising in music and faith, people specialising in community engagement and other areas, building specialists, energy specialists, and our youth members, and then myself and the university. And our 2 newest are from Norfolk Wildlife Trust and Friends of the Earth, and from the Norfolk Ambulance Service as well, so for a bit of transport work as well. But we all work together to be the commission is the idea. So some data that I think probably you're familiar with, a map, which is where Norwich's emissions come from. So this is by ward, and blue means low emissions, low carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and red means high carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere compared to the national average. So you can possibly spot your ward there, and you'll have seen that we're mostly blue in Norwich, and that's because in general we're lower emitters than other areas, the UK average, and that's what that bar chart is showing. On the left is Norwich at 7,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, and then the national average is more like 8,000, so we come in a bit lower. Now the annoying part of those two bars, which is split up into the different economic activities that make up emissions, because it's all about energy, is the black line, and that's where the climate emergency target is. That's where the net zero target is. So that would be getting from 7,000 tonnes down to 3,000 tonnes, kind of 2035-ish, if that was the given target we were heading for. And I will move on to the the ski slope there that nobody would ever ski down, not that I'm a skier, is the net zero target for Norwich, for the Norwich City area. So black is progress so far, and green is what needs to happen to get to that net zero target by 2050. And net zero is the UK target through the Climate Change Act, based on the Paris Agreement of 2015. So that's all countries reducing their emissions so that there is net zero emissions, no more emissions going into the atmosphere. If there's emissions going into the atmosphere, they have to be sucked up. So that's a sort of a true zero, and that ski slope shows where that would have to be if we were actually going to hit net zero targets. And if we weren't going to hit net zero targets, and anyway we know what is likely to happen with climate change, or what is already happening with climate change, is the need to not only reduce emissions, but there's a need to adapt to the impacts of climate change as well, as to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. So this is some work that's going on, has been going on. It's some of my work with colleagues, whereby it's a national climate change risk assessment. We're looking at in a finer scale, never done before, in a way never done before. We're looking at what are the impacts of climate change on the UK across different sectors. So we're looking at agriculture, heat stress, flooding, as we're looking at economic development. There's various parts we're looking at, but we have been drilling down into Norwich a little bit to see what's happening in Norwich. And so although these are small, I could do this as a sort of bigger presentation, but I won't, because there's loads of data here and you don't want to see all of it. But we can do things like, with population growth, looking at Norwich now and Norwich into the future. Where will people live? Where will be developed? Where will be more urban, where more density than now? So that's that first one in the top left. How many people and where will they live under different population scenarios? The one on the right is where what might be developed under these different population scenarios. Blue is where it isn't being developed, or the areas that are grey haven't been developed. But then you can see with large population growth, you get things like what have we got? Where you can see all the areas, kind of the biodiversity areas, really get turned into developments. That's regardless of their statutory protection. So that's theoretically, that's not necessarily saying, well, actually this area is unlikely to be developed because it's a nature reserve or some such. Anybody here is going to be very familiar, bottom left-hand side, around coastal flooding and sea level rise, which we are experiencing already on the Norfolk coast. And we've been doing some work which is actually a little bit relevant to the East Norwich development that we might talk about, which is right on the river. And looking at Phil's had some people looking at the downriver hydrology. The water coming out of the Wensum catchment down into Norwich, and also the water coming up the Broads up the Riviera into the Broads as well. So that's some work we've got and we've been looking at in quite some detail. And sort of the takeaway from there is what I've written really is Whitlingham Broad basically is Norwich's Thames barrier. You know, all that undeveloped area, all that natural area is what soaks up the water as it comes upstream at the moment, and similarly shows the importance of ecosystem services to these free services that nature provides to us. And Whitlingham Broad is very important there. And then we've been looking at things like heat-related mortality as well, but also lost work days and other measures of heat mortality as well, which even with COVID numbers, it isn't particularly high for Norwich, but other areas in the UK it's more significant. So there's a heap of data there, and I'm not going to run you through it all now. Back to the Commission is roughly these four areas of interest. So risk and adaptation I've just spoken about. So this is Norwich to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change and what's going to happen and how might that happen. Energy, talked a bit about emissions and where emissions come from in Norwich, at least by where people live and the economic sectors. That's one area. Community engagement, as you can imagine, and community empowerment, citizens and working with citizens and supporting citizens and community groups. And of course, there's a lot of crossover. So with the energy cost crisis at the moment, there's been lots more interest than perhaps there would have been if it had just been an issue around carbon. This is about people's living standards now, and buildings as well, so low carbon buildings, which ties into East Norwich as well as other things. And somewhere in the middle there, we coordinate all that. And so our sort of brands for that, or our sections, are Our Power, which is all about the community engagement. That is a little map of East Norwich there, which is somewhere we're trying to focus on a little bit. If you think about that carbon budget, that ski slope, if you're going to put in 2,000 dwellings, then of course that ski slope gets even harder to do, or the bar graph gets even harder to do if population keeps going up, and that's not a zero carbon population. Then the carbon budget for Norwich gets blown, whether it's Anglia Square or East Norwich, wherever it is, if it's not below carbon development. And energy crosses all over with these as well, and risk and adaptation that I just spoke about. On community empowerment, by coincidence, well actually no, I won't talk to that yet. And a little bit about our sort of business plan at the moment. We're applying for funding, which I'll talk to in a minute. So we have a small amount of money from Norwich, from the City Council, that helps us tick over a little bit and goes on to some of the administrative support that helps me and helps us with our events. UEA has given us money in various ways. It's given us money in lots of different ways in kind, but it's paid for interns. It's given me £5,000 to do work focused down on this Norwich climate change risk assessment. I put some of my own money in because I do consultancy, and I can. Is better spent on commission activities, and sort of outside of Norwich, but very close. I've been working with Broadland and South Norfolk District Council on a tool for biodiversity and carbon management that their land managers can use. Which I won't talk too much about that. Attempted fundraising, however, so Net Zero Norwich, which we weren't successful with, but it did help a Norfolk Climate Change Partnership proposal, which did get funded. So even though we did get funded, it's been very helpful in the wider context, and there's a Norwich community in that. Small amount of money for energy advice demonstrators, and this morning at 12 o'clock I had an interview with the National Lottery, whereby I applied for £1.5 million of Norwich community groups to work around. It's a climate and energy academy for Norwich is the proposal. Whether it goes further, we've only just finished the interview, but at least we got an interview rather than saying thank you, but no thank you, don't apply again. So we are trying to get funding. We might go nowhere, but we are applying. And we put in for another, of the domestic energy advice demonstrators, there was actually a 2 million pot that we applied for. It didn't get either, but eventually, you have to, like the National Lottery, you have to be in it to win it. And then just some of the things that money is going on, but you've kind of seen that in some of the presentations that we've got already. We also that's not the right word. We also work with students at UEA so that they can do some timely reports on some of the things that we're thinking about and want to work with. So this is last year's series. So impacts on Norwich, stakeholder engagement around energy, fuel poverty, and we've got a really quite good, and I've not done anything with it, economic analysis of the costs and benefits of sort of zero carbon for Norwich, which is that number 4 there, a summary carbon roadmap for Norwich. So we've got that as well, and that was done by a freebie for colleagues from Leeds University. I won't run through this so much, but this is sort of just work in progress, community engagement, the stuff we've done. We've done surveys, we've had some events. We're a partner with Norwich Theatre, always do something at the Norwich Science Festival, etc. So this is just a sort of list of things that we're doing that are badged with the Climate Commission, or sometimes they're things that we're only doing because they're the Climate Commission, because for me personally, I used to have quite an international focus. This means I now have a remit to be looking to do more local engagement and local work. The one I'll mention there from policy is the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership. So we've got quite a good close relationship there and do a lot of talking to them, and also with Norfolk County Council as well. And I wrote a briefing for the All-Parliamentary Group last November, which again and it got very well received, what needs to happen in the east of England around climate change. And again, that was very well received and only done because of the Commission, otherwise I possibly wouldn't have done it. Lots of work on buildings, not only East Norwich, elsewhere as well. Collaborating with the Norwich Society, there's going to be a pilot design review that Anthony Hudson, our architect and one of the co-chairs, will be going on to. East Norwich, which we spoke about, very much looking at operation of embedded energy in buildings. Transport, we've not had very much progress. But I was very pleased to see Emma's talking about 20 is plenty in the local newspaper just recently, which is something to be supported. And I also wonder, from my own perspective, from 20 is plenty, whether there's opportunity for starting it as a community campaign before it gets to sort of top-down policy issues as well. We've done a youth survey, the biodiversity system function work I spoke about. With Broadland and South Norfolk, carrying on with funding, also carrying on the work of the Good Economy Commission. There's quite a lot of threads running through what it is that we're doing with the Good Economy Commission that completed, but we're keeping an eye on that, and if that National Lottery funding happens, then it's embedded in there as well. So it's not just environment and sustainability in terms of sort of climate and carbon and impacts. There's about jobs and skills and empowerment and these other aspects, and various UEA bits going on there that I won't talk about. Right when we began, so this is right beginning, January 2022, we did a survey. So we actually have quite a lot of data that I haven't actually measured ourselves against that data yet, but we asked lots of stakeholders what it is they wanted to do, and that actually informs our work plan, and that informs our 4 circles of activity as well. The youth members have also done their own survey as well, so we have a survey of youngsters from the city colleges and the sixth form colleges, which hopefully will report soon. And that's important that we have this baseline data, because we're about citizens as well, not just the technology. So it's important we have that. And so, coming to the end of my recommendations, use the commission. We're here as a friend. So ask questions, involve us in decision making, go upstream. I reckon we've got about, some of our members won't thank me for this, but probably about 140 years worth of expertise sitting on the commission. That's all to do with either energy or climate or very local or very relevant areas. So there's a lot of expertise sitting in there from different government departments and all sorts. We're actually very lucky to have such good commissioners. Traffic and air quality, everyone's talking about 20 is plenty in the newspapers. It's a tricky one, I know, because it's not necessarily to do with the City Council, but it's an important one for lots of reasons. I don't need to rehearse here. Air quality and health for the same reasons. Some of our poorest areas have got the least good health outcomes, and also air quality as a result of where they are. Things like East Norwich and Anglia Square have to be as zero carbon as they can get, as well as resilient to the impacts of climate change, especially East Norwich. We've been talking about the Norwich standards, trying to get better guidelines for buildings in Norwich than, even though there's better standards coming down the pipeline for building buildings, we're quite interested in the idea of Norwich having a higher standard that developers then have to look to get favourable planning. And there are some examples of this. So Cornwall has done this, for example, where they basically put their own rules and regulations. If people want to get planning, then they have to come with better than the bare minimum, even though the bare minimum is getting better. And economic growth, going back to that report we got on the economics of net zero for Norwich. So this is 2020 figures, so those are the best figures at the time, but clearly out of date. So at that point, 6% of Norwich's GDP was spent on energy. I'm not going to guess what it is now, but it's going to be at least 8%, isn't it? 8 pence in every pound is being spent on people's heating and energy bills at the moment. That doesn't include transport, by the way. And back in 2017, that was 4.8. So these measures do pay for themselves, and it would reduce the entire energy bill. But it's not only about bills, is it? That's an economist talking. There's a lot more reasons for reducing spend on energy than just those traditional financial economic arguments. And just to remake the point again around resilience and adaptation, in addition to low carbon, I think what's happened with just the way it is, government policy is very focused on zero carbon. It's very important, but there's also the need to be resilient and adapt to the impacts of climate change that are not already with us, but we know are coming down the pipeline. Sea level rise, for example, it happens anyway. It doesn't matter what. If we hit zero carbon tomorrow, we still get sea level rise for the next millennia. And so these things are happening. They're in the system, and so we have to work with these rather than focus only on net zero. And there'll be a next climate change risk assessment coming down, the fourth climate change risk assessment. The work I showed you for Norwich is what we hope within the Tyndall Centre will begin to be the analysis used for a quantified risk assessment under the fourth climate change risk assessment. They've been qualitative before, but we're hoping we've got data now that they can better inform. And we're looking at zeroing down in Norwich, a few other places as well, and we're hoping, if we get the funding, to do a Norfolk climate change risk assessment so that we really know what's going on and what the responses are. And of course, Norwich is a bit in the middle there in terms of importance. So sorry if I talked about a lot about adaptation, but it's something I'm working on quite a lot now. So it's just something that's in my mind right now. I'll stop there, if I may, and hopefully that was not too over time.
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think from my perspective, it was a really good overview of where we've got to and how we've got there. I'll open it up to questions. I saw Councillor Champion first.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. Unfortunately, you haven't come in the jacket with all the clouds on. As well, I was speaking with my students earlier. We were gambling whether you would or not. Anyway,
my suit is more famous than I am.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, there's loads which, it's like the Whitlingham Broad being Norwich's flood barrier. That's something which struck me as quite pertinent, and I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. I guess I kind of acknowledged it, but do we need to have more stringent? Do we need to make sure that we've got policy in place to protect that? Are we guaranteed that there won't be developments in that area which would, undermine our flood defences? Is there any, just as an open question?
Well, I don't know about development plans, Phil might, but it certainly can't be compromised in any way whatsoever, and ideally, in an ideal world, it needs to be expanded or made more resilient because the ecosystem services, it soaks up water. We're less concerned about the water coming down the river, as I said, it's more the water coming up the river, and so anything that can make it more sponge-like, and then that sponge slowly drains, it's a free ecosystem service that, yes, you could spend, well, not you, but billions on a barrier, or we enhance the free ecosystem services.
Could I follow up that question then? Just in relation to, because you spoke initially about theory to practice and working with the council and you've mentioned about working with other councils. And so therefore, evidently you've given this present, you've said this to other people and people in power. I'm just for the opposition. So, I've got no sway. But what I would like to know is there anything in place to ensure that this vital resource is held in situ and isn't developed? I mean, is there any, or is it just all theory at the moment? We know this in theory, but there's no practice.
I might put over to Phil on the sort of statutory.
So all development on floodplain has a statutory obligation to mitigate any loss of floodplain. So the East Norwich Strategic Region Development Area is on floodplain. And so there's lots of modelling been done to ensure that the developments there don't exacerbate flooding or don't compromise the ability of the floodplain to and give rise to the future risk of flooding. So that's a statutory obligation that is ultimately determines the effectiveness of the plans put forward by our developers are ultimately determined by the Environment Agency. So that is pretty robust.
Okay, that's reassuring. Thank you.
And it needs enhancing. So we've got the keeping it static, so that the amount of water is the same as the amount of water going out, but it would need enhancing in some way, not least because if there's going to be more roofs, more hard standing, more drainage coming off, then it has to absorb that as well.
Yeah.
So we've got cumulative, maybe extreme rainfall events, perhaps, which gives some flooding, and that's all coming off the roofs and the car parks and whatever. But then we have sea level rise on top of that as well, and on top of that, then we have the sea level rise, but then we have the storminess. So these high pressure systems, the storm surges we get that come up the air. So these all sit on top of each other, and so ideally, in the ideal world, you would have it so that it's resilient to that top level, whatever that might be. So I know this has been streamed, don't hold me on this, but if that was 2 meters, then you want to be at the top, because it's about having and this is my risk assessment interest, it's about having a threshold. So what is the threshold to which you want to be protected? London is 1 in 1,000 years because of the Thames barrier. Some parts of the Netherlands are possibly 1 in 2,500, I think, because in the Netherlands they decided that people who live in deep Holland have as much right not to be flooded as people who live just on the coast. So therefore you have to have a high threshold to protect those people. I personally think similarly about Norfolk. So from a policy perspective, there's thinking there about what is that threshold, where should that threshold be, not only for now, but also into the future and for how long. So houses are said to last about 50 years, but it's generally quite a lot longer than that. Sorry, I'll be quiet because you.
No, it's great.
So I think what not only in Norwich but for wider Norfolk, I think that threshold question, which is absolutely an evidence-based question out to policymakers, at what point do you want to be safe? For people to be safe, and at what point do you wish to be open for business into the future, because the threshold is there that you are resilient against with all these sort of cumulative stuff.
I know there's going to be lots of questions. Can I just ask one more follow-up?
If it's directly a follow-up, go on. Then
Did
we'll
you
move
say
on.
this when you did your parliamentary presentation?
No, at that point I said we needed a risk assessment.
Okay.
The reason isn't because that was done November last year. We've got a lot of results that have come through since. The supercomputers have been crunching through and doing the numbers and spitting them out and maps and graphs and things. And so that was but that was also to all of East of England MPs. But now we've got pretty good data now, actually, which we didn't have a year ago.
Okay. Shut up.
I saw Councillor Lubbock, Councillor Stutely, then Councillor
Yeah,
Fox.
that was an interesting response, because this summer we did have a lot of sudden floods, and the River Yare experienced lack of oxygen, and the fish died, and Environment Agency got involved and had to sort of do various things to sort of try and pump oxygen in, and it was all very interesting, because there it was happening in front of us, and the Environment Agency, the Rivers Trust, everyone's looking at the Yare to sort of try and find ways of making its capacity bigger, so that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. And it's quite sort of low key. Some of the things that they're trying, it's sort of making these sort of oxbow lakes and things like that to try and direct the water so that it extends the floodplain. But of course, you've got to have that land to be able to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And
At
we
a
just
very
had one
local level.
this weekend. I think actually it was a very, very high tide that was flooded out because of the full moon. It's actually, so this is well, it kind of is fact-based because I've looked at the numbers, but fishermen and sailors, I sail on the Yare, so just report it much more high tides than they used to get, more dead fish than they used to get because the salt water comes up. My own sailing club, Coldham Hall at Surlingham, probably about 15 years ago, they actually moved the clubhouse back because they got fed up of it getting flooded. And so that wasn't a climate change or sea level rise decision, that was just, we would like a dry clubhouse. But then if you go look at the data at Great Yarmouth, you can see that the tides are getting higher over time, just the tide gauges.
But some of the problems with the pollution came from the flyover, sort of the A11 flyover down onto the water, and it was a perfect storm, really. But my question is, I'm very interested in the 20s Plenty, and I think that would be a great way of getting engagement from the public to think, well, this is something I can do, or this is something I'm not going to do, and then to try and persuade them that it's in their best interest to do, to try to understand, because although we brought in, the county and the city brought in 20 mile per hour limits, they didn't have any money when doing so to educate people people still are very ignorant about why. And so I think that, any information that could be got out there to help people understand, and there's so many different ways that it has an impact. Just from someone taking their children to school by walking rather than taking the car, or by someone deciding to cycle, or what they might gain themselves by travelling at 20. And this engagement can happen at various levels, and I think it's a discussion that would be really useful for the public to have, and across the whole of the city.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think there's always this tension, probably in all policy. I just happen to do climate and environment, but about sort of top down and then behaviour change things that sort of come up from here. So it would be quite, in the absence of top down, for now, it would be quite interesting to try and start some of the bottom-up
understanding of it,
whether that be in schools or particularly affected communities. I think I didn't do a proper thing. I did a sort of just worked it out a while ago. I think it's probably the biggest reduction that Norwich could make in its emissions is by going from 30 to 20 because of course, the reduction in fuel burn, but also things like particulates, so it's not only just the amount burnt in the engine, but I think that was did I write it down here actually? I did, because I did this a while ago. Yeah, it's about 20% decline in particulates and 20%
in noise
pollution.
And that's something people don't.
Well, and that's a well-being thing as well. And then we go to some of the communities who are nearest the main roads and have the trucks coming down the roads that were never meant to have trucks on because they were built a long time ago, these roads. That's a very clear indicator for some of those communities as well.
And the fact that sort of the roads are always a barrier, but if it's 20, they can easily cross the road, and you get more interaction on each side of the road.
And then some of the things that Sustrans does is, of course, if you haven't got great big lorries or lorry goods, people then feel safer to do a bit more active travel type things as well, as long as the weather's nice. So there's quite a lot of things that end up being self-reinforced by just a gentler way of using engines.
And just by the by, BT Passive are a house building organisation that established themselves, and it would be lovely to sort of somehow engage with them to see if they could do anything in Norwich as a sort of exemplar, really. They're working in Cardiff, I think. It's nice to have something like that in our city.
I'd just like to say we are engaged.
Oh, good. They've got a demonstration tomorrow morning.
We've been to their factory.
Oh, right, I'm going tomorrow morning, so find out more about it. Thank you.
I had Councillor Steatley next.
Thank you. Someone's mic's on.
Oh, we've got robot mics over here. There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. I've got a direct question going back to the flooding. Just on the 20-mile-an-hour zones, it's been this administration's policy for quite a long time to introduce them, and unfortunately there's been reluctance from the county council to implement those on main roads. So perhaps you could just reiterate for us again with some technical terms how important it would be to extend it to main roads. Unfortunately, some of the main roads where we do have the restrictions in place, it is almost completely ignored by drivers. So again, some emphasis on the importance. But going back to the flooding, potential flooding in Norwich, reading between the lines, I was quite concerned about what you said. So a direct question is, if the East Norwich development goes ahead in its current form and with the current planning, is Norwich going to flood?
So this would be more of an engineer answer, perhaps. There is lots of ways to do adaptation to flooding. So there's lots of places around the world, and I've been fortunate to visit some that are very well constructed to cope with flooding, to cope with storms, to cope with hurricanes, things that we're not used to here. So I think it can be developed in, well, obviously it will be developed anyway, regardless. But it's about it being developed in the right way, and that's a little bit where I talked about this Norwich standard, so that the requirements are a bit above, sort of the cumulative impacts, so that the standards are a bit above the minimum that you would get from the Environment Agency, or looking at coastal data. There's, as one example, so there's one place I happen to have been to whereby all the businesses on the ground floor are things like cafes and hairdressers and places that they're built to flood, because they know it's in Havana. They know that it's going to flood. They know these huge hurricanes are going to come, but when they do, they can get back into action within 24 hours. It's not what it's the entire local economy isn't wiped out. The plug points aren't down here; they're up there. Things like that. They've got easy sweepable floors to drain out. So it's certainly not the job of the Climate Commission to. There's expert planners and developers and builders who can talk about those things. But I think it's with the knowledge of how to respond to things like flood, drainage, seawalls. I sail on the air out of Surlingham, and most of where I'm sailing, my boat is above the land purely because of the seawalls that run along the air and all the drainage that's happened and the pumping and things. So I think that's a sort of slightly technical answer to perhaps what is a political question. Presumably there'll be zone development. There'll be some areas that are a bit easier to develop. They might be a bit higher up. Other places might need a bit of extra caution. But I think that's what science can do, hopefully, is bring the data so that decisions that are made are at least based on the best of what it is we know, with a little bit of extra leeway threshold on top of that.
Phil, did you want to comment on that point quickly first, and then do you want to follow up?
Yeah, just wanted to confirm that flood risk is very firmly on the risk register for East Norwich. I'm going to be covering some of the similar material in my presentation. We're seeing some pretty good predictions of sea level rise now, that when there's international consensus on the range, although there's still a fair bit of uncertainty. And there are active discussions with County, who have an obligation around strategic planning for Norfolk, obviously, and a work stream with the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership to look at a flood mapping exercise for the entire county to understand what that looks like over the coming decades to 2100, which is where we just about have some certainty. 2050 to 2100 is sort of modelable by very clever people, scientists, so that's an active discussion underway. But as I say, we have the National Planning Policy Framework to fall back on, which requires flood mitigation to flood risk to be managed for the life of any buildings that are built. So it's all pretty robustly protected using existing legislation.
Did you have a quick follow-up to that?
Yes, thank you. I think probably it wasn't a political question. I'm just interested to know what might happen in Norwich. And we know that developers will always use the national guidance and the law to try and minimise their own costs. So what do you think will be the cost of adding a new layer or a new tier of requirements at a local level to developers, and will they be able to wriggle out of it?
I think just having looked at the Cornwall, who've done their own guidelines, I think it's planners having those documents and it's been tested in court and things, and to behind them, I think is what I would see as the important part. And so the cost itself presumably is kind of passed on to the developers. If they wish to develop, then they have to develop to a particular standard, and they would factor that into their designs and their costs. I'm talking about not an area I work in. But when I said it was like a political question, I didn't mean it as putting that question back. It was just that really it's the planners and it's the people who sign off in the planning. It's not the data providers and the scenario forecasters. That's what I meant by it was a political thing. So it was the people who make the decisions.
Can I come back again? But I think
Phil, were you on that point?
Yeah. We've been talking about East Norwich, so let's just stay with that particular development for the moment. We've actually got a really a very strong policy for energy in East Norwich that will be that is part of the Greater Norwich Local Plan. Still not formally adopted, but it's firmly embedded in there. And that is that energy will be sustainable. And what my team's involved with at the moment is the writing of something called a supplementary planning document, which clarifies how planners want to see that policy embedded in the development. It follows a piece of work that we did earlier in the year to look at the sustainable energy options at East Norwich. There's lots, essentially, we are moving away from gas, moving away from combustion. So it is an electrification of heat and transport, and the SBD will pretty much let developers decide whether they want to go down a very high standard of fabric efficiency or whether they want to use renewable energy. So there has to be some flexibility. We have to let the market sort of work out the best options for itself, the developers. But yes, we are putting in place an ambitious and formal supplementary planning document for East Norwich.
Did you have one last quick follow-up? Then
Yes.
I've got Councillor Fox.
Please, thank you. Yes, there was some reassurances in there that are pleasing to hear. But of course, it's too late for Anglia Square unless we can do anything retrospectively. But my concern about this is that developers work around viability, and if there's an additional expense with one element like energy or flood mitigation, there's going to be an issue elsewhere. So, for example, social housing will be the first thing that they cut, and then they use the viability as a reason to have low social housing. So, while I'm reassured and encouraged by this, I think the planning system needs to change.
Councillor Fox.
Firstly, I need to belatedly declare an interest because I'm currently studying at UEA as well, not in climate science, though. So,
I don't think that's an interest.
That's all right.
but I don't know if that matters.
Better safe than sorry.
So I'm interested in all this. I totally agree with you, Councillor Stewley. The planning process needs to change. But one of the things I'm interested in is with the graph that you showed us, there was a certain portion that had already been achieved, and there was a portion that we have yet to achieve in a certain amount of time. Percentage-wise over time, like how has that been? So what percentage over time have we achieved as compared to the percentage over time that we need to achieve in order to do that? And what does that mean in terms of spending? Like what percentage have we spent compared to what we need to spend? So I'm wondering about whether we are like kicking it down the road a bit, or whether we are on target with spending, I suppose.
Phil, have you been looking at scatter recently, which is where the data comes from?
Do you know, can I respectfully request you just hang on to that question? We'll come to a graph in my presentation that sort of talks around that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. In that case, can I have another question?
Yes, go on then. That's fine.
With the so there's yeah, with the transport thing, obviously the 20 is plenty goes a long way to addressing what we need to do in terms of reducing some of those emissions. I'm wondering whether the UEA have the data of the particulate, like across Norwich, basically, whether there's a good map over time of what's going on there, and also in terms of like an education campaign. Active transport has so many benefits for health, and obviously is lower carbon than even driving at 20 miles an hour. But currently, we've had 6 people die on our city streets this year from cycling, and every time I get on my bike to go to work, I feel like I'm, is this going to be the one where I don't come home? So, yeah, I feel like that is a thing that also needs to really be kind of pushed. And what's the question? That wasn't really a question, was it? But the one about the emissions and the mapping of that.
The City Council with Phil's predecessor had really good particulate data, because I remember, so this is pre-COVID and the rest of it, but I remember looking at it, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, and I know transport changed from the City Council to the County Council, and I'm not sure when that happened, but last time, yeah, okay, so it would have been before that. So last time I looked, there is quite good particulate data. It's very specific because it's where it's where it's been captured, it's where it's being monitored. You can see some of the monitor stations around Norwich, but around by the Ring Road. But they also have portable samplers, which almost look like a beaker type thing. So they take the portable samplers around. So from that I know that St Augustine in particular is pretty bad, which I don't think you need to be an air quality specialist to work out with a very narrow street. It's called canyoning, so the air pollution can't go anywhere, and of course this is a main artery out of Norwich for the buses and the trucks and the cars and everybody who's been shopping. So that, I think that was had the highest amount of particulates that I can remember when I was looking at the data a few years ago. I've got it somewhere. But I'm sure the data has been resampled, and then there was also a dip because of COVID and people weren't travelling. It's possible that it's sort of back up roughly to where it was. So like a lot of these things, there's plenty of data. It's actually analysing in a useful way that informs decisions is often the challenge. I would like, and I haven't thought about this because I thought about it quite a long time ago, I would ideally a student or somebody equally good to do a bit of an analysis about 20 is plenty and what are the costs, what are the benefits, where is the data. Just a death study, nothing too rigorous, but just to see, get some numbers to the argument, and maybe interview a few communities to find out if they were interested and this is something that they would like to see where they are. And similarly, does it, from other people's results, it does promote active travel, but would that work in Norwich as well? Would perhaps people be more likely to do this school run by bike or something than if there was slower speeds?
Councillor Champion, then Councillor Oliver.
Like a million questions, but there's a couple which, would extending the floodplain at Willing and Broad, would that also address our nutrients issue? Would they correlate? And the second question, which is my ignorance, is when we talk about particulate pollution, to what degree does particulate pollution actually work with climate change? Are they two distinct issues? Because, I view it as a health issue as opposed to a climate change issue. Or does the particulate pollution contribute to climate change additionally on a local level?
Extending the floodplain, this is Asher as an ex-ecologist a long time ago, then yes. would be the answer to
I knew the
that
answer
one,
to
which
that,
I
but
think
yes,
is straightforward. You don't have to. From what we're talking about, which is the particulates that come out of exhaust and off of tyres and brake dust, so it's not only what comes out of brake dust and tyres, brake dust is particularly terrible actually. One of my colleagues has picked up tyre particulates in Antarctica now, I think. So there is nowhere that there aren't cars on the planet, even though there aren't cars there. So that's probably more of a health thing. To be nerdy about it, there's sort of black carbon, which is particulates at a much higher level, and they do have an effect, and in some ways they have a cooling effect. But we're talking about here and now in Norwich at lung and pushchair level, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Oliver. Councillor Fox.
Thank you. Yes, I was wondering if we could hear some more about some wood burners and effect, because there's some mention of the smokeless zone or smoke control zone back in 1972. Would we be anticipating banning them, or is there a way of getting a significant improvement in air quality with a reduction? Do we know where that lies?
Yeah, it's exactly as you've said. So if we take cars away for the minute, the biggest growth is in this isn't necessarily in Norwich, but walking around of winter evenings, I think there's probably quite a lot, and speaking to neighbours and colleagues and stuff, there's a lot more wood burners being installed in otherwise urban city areas, which obviously for lifestyle reasons, it's not about keeping warm. So yes, there has been a smoke control area in Norwich for a very long time, and so while the standards there are standards in place on wood burners, people theoretically shouldn't be installing any old wood burner, but of course they do, because anybody can install a wood burner in a chimney. It is probably, from a very local point of view, for people living around where wood burners are newly installed, those are the people who've got asthma and who can smell it, so it's more local than car pollution in a way. It's really around particular pockets. But again, it does, from a national perspective, it does seem to be a growth area. It's become a sort of a lifestyle thing in particular bits of the city. I don't know why there hasn't been smoke control declared since 1972. I just thought that would have been updated at some point, but anyway, that's a different thing.
I've got Councillor Fox and Councillor Stuteley. I'm aware we've been going for about an hour. Okay, so if we go around with one last question each, then maybe we'll bring it to a close, if that's all right.
Yeah, so you showed the graphs or the pictures of the heat-related mortality, and I think I speak for all of us. As a baseline, we want to keep people who we represent alive. So I wondered, well, I can be cheeky and fit a couple of things in. So over time, so by 2050, with current policies, how is that mortality? What is the increase in that mortality predicted to be? And with that graph that showed the reductions, what percentage of those reductions currently come from reduction of emissions, and what percentage of them come from sucking carbon out of the atmosphere? What would you, if you were us and you could do anything, what would you do?
Okay, mortality is, I mean, it's a terrible thing to say out loud, is less than 20 people in 2050 from heat stress. That's still 20 people and 20 families. So
that's in Norwich.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to.
And that's on current policies.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, that's well, that's with the growth in population and under current warming scenarios. So I'd just like to put that around any figures that is actually 20 people or forecast. around reductions in emissions is all to do with mostly not all anymore, but mostly initially it was the national change. If I bring back that black, so the black line there, that's mostly to do with the national change where it went from stinky burning coal in power stations to gas. But then there are lots of policies in place now around energy efficiency of appliances and light bulbs and.
So that's all reductions.
Yes, yeah. So a lot of it is big industry changes that was nothing to do with any local policies, but the local policies are coming in now, and we've done analysis of countries that have these policies have much faster reductions in emissions than countries that don't. So we can account a little bit more for the gist. It was the closing down the coal mines. It's that's gone now. With that effect has been. And then your next one, I think, would be. I mean, some of it's happening, and I have to congratulate the City Council and Phil and colleagues. So there's been a lot of retrofitting on, in particular, of social housing. So that's a really easy way to get emissions down now and into the future for quite a long time, as long as those properties exist. Transport emissions, we've sort of spoken about, which is in Norfolk and Norwich, but Norwich, again, I haven't really looked, COVID put it off, but Norwich at points in time has equal, if not higher, pollution to London. I won't explain the mechanisms for that right now because you want to get onto other things, but I could explain why that is. It isn't all because of the cars and people in Norwich, it's for big air circulation reasons and the direction with the wind from London and things like that. And your third question, what would I do? Still that same question is, and I'm bound to say that I've been working in climate change for decades, is put environment front and centre. Because it's not a cost, it's a win. And if environment sustainability is the lens through which all policies and decisions are made, everything else falls off of that, be that equality, income, skills, health, well-being, sense of place, all these other things that I think probably that we all would have in common, kind of fall out of sustainability, but we don't even have to talk about sustainability to make that happen. We don't have to be eco. We just say, oh no, rather than pound, shilling and pence, we're actually going to have this other way of looking at it, which is a much wider economy. And so all policies, and they are in some ways, to be looked at through an environment lens, not only what's the cost, because they're not trade-offs, they're one and the same thing. So that's my finished preaching, I think. But thank you for the question.
Councillor Stutley?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Going back to the question about wood burners, we had a scrutiny meeting a couple of years ago now, where we focused on this in some detail. I'm just looking at the minutes, and it was determined at the time that we wouldn't recommend a zone for banning the burning of fuel. I think we opted for a softer approach, which was an educational thing, and I think that's probably something we can go back to, and perhaps even consider 2 years down the line whether it's more important now to actually have a look at putting some restrictions in, certainly in the zones that you're talking about, where it's not required for heating, but a lifestyle choice. So the comment rather than a question.
Thank you.
No problem. We'll go back and have a look at some of the reasoning behind that at the time, and if it's worth reconsidering. I heard Councillor Champion.
So, right early on, you said about resilience and risk assessments. You identified agriculture as a key element. I would suggest that we've got a triple crisis, we've got climate change, biodiversity, and we've got a food crisis, which is going to loom and is not addressed in any way, shape, or form. You're again theory to practice. I mean, this has been acknowledged for decades that this is on the horizon. With somewhere like the Fens as one of the most agricultural areas in the country, if that was flooded, we would then, that would, and with international trends in other countries like India not selling rice, etc., this is all what we know. How do we take that theory into practice from a local council perspective, working with community groups, but how is this an area that's being addressed? You identified it earlier.
On food specifically? Sorry.
Agriculture, food security, in relation to climate change and biodiversity crisis and the expected outcomes of those. Have we got work in place at a policy level to address this third tier of crisis, which is largely ignored?
Agriculture absolutely is in my area, but I've got some fabulous colleagues who do work in this. Again, there's that two aspects. There's sort of responding to changing patterns in weather and changing international supply chains and the like. And I think I don't know enough about that actually to give a coherent answer. It would just be my opinion. Around net zero agriculture, so one of the interesting, you raised it, the Fens, one of the big sources of emissions in Norfolk, for the reasons you say, is agriculture, and it kind of doesn't get ignored, that's not fair, but we tend to focus on the built environment perhaps, or the mobility, the cars for moving around, but there's a big land use aspect to emissions as well. In addition to it being peat soils, which are carbon-based soils, and every time they get dried, they release and the like, and ideally you would re-wet the lot of it, not from a food security perspective, but from a how to suck up carbon, how to be net zero. I'm going to say this anyway, because I can. There's some crops being grown in the region, such as sugar beet, an addictive substance being grown to be fed to children. That doesn't seem like a very good very good use of prime agricultural land when you could actually be growing useful, nutritious food on it. And I know a lot of people would argue with me about that. But I think there is a lot more wise ways of using land. This isn't my area of specialism than we have now, and that comes into the resilience. So resilience isn't only about climate impacts and sea level rise and extreme rainfall, it's actually being resilient to global shocks and food supply and using precious, priceless land.
If it's a direct drop, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you had been in Havana. I would be curious if you think that Norwich should adapt the policy which they had in Havana about urban agriculture to mitigate food security issues at the end of communism.
I don't know too much about that. I was a guest at the embassy, so I've got no idea what the food security issues were. But I think there's definitely a wider. I mean, of course, it's all interlinked. But going from, it's not Norwich in isolation. It's looking out into the county as well. And I have colleagues working with. In fact, one of them runs a net zero agriculture network to try and encourage food producers from a system perspective to look at reducing emissions in the whole operations, the way that food gets to our plate, not just how it's grown in the field or harvested. So all that has to change as part of this resilience as well, yeah.
Councillor Fox, were you coming in on this point?
So I know there's really good research that urban allotments provide more food per acre than intensive agriculture.
Okay.
And
not my allotment.
Mine neither, unless you can eat the nettles. So at the moment, I think what we were saying about that vision of things, if so much room is being taken up by transport, that's room that could be used for things like this. So I think what you're saying about sort of positive messaging and stuff like that, there's room for us to completely reimagine what our cities can be, I think. And is food security going to be an issue in Norwich? With growing populations, with climate migration?
I don't think it would be more of an issue here than anywhere else. I think, so yesterday I happened to tune into a meeting, possibly it was in this room, where the next, what's the next plan, city vision, is being worked up for Norwich. And so I think some of that is back to the question before about environment and sustainability being front and centre of that. So not only Norwich is an entrepreneurial city, or to have growing businesses, to have all that, but to have environment as the lens that everything sort of hangs off from there. So I don't think there's anything specific about Norwich that makes it more sensitive to food security issues than anywhere else. But then there is planning issues here, because I've lived here a few years, and there's a lot of I shop there as well, Aldi's and Lidl's and places like that huge amounts of packaging. Mm-hmm. That's what my blue bin is full of, because that's where I shop. So there's looking at those in the round, and it'd be interesting to have discussions with some of those companies that have 8 to 10 outlets maybe within Greater Norwich perhaps. Because it isn't only the availability of food and the price of food, which is all very important, but it also the rubbish. And then who is it who takes the rubbish away and pays for it to be? So the whole thing goes all the way through.
I suppose that goes back to the Norwich standard. If one could, try and achieve something different to other cities.
I think so. I think Norwich. I do. I live here, but I'm biased. But I think Norwich is quite unique. I think in its people, its population. It is the only city around. There isn't any nearby rivals. It can set the agenda. It can be the exemplar. This national lottery funding that we're applying for, the community's up for it. I won't go into the details of that, but we've got some really good communities, and it's not the obvious people that you would expect to be wanting to do things around climate and energy. Those aren't the communities involved. There's
Can
so
I just
much
through you, Chair, ask what is Eton doing wrong? Why are we omitting more?
It's wealthy.
It's wealthy.
It's wealth.
It's
so those colours are completely correlated with wealth.
Socio-economic.
It's
high economic activity in transport is what I thought.
Yeah. So those are the wealthy areas. So Norwich is maybe lots of cities are like this, but Norwich is blue because it's poorer, and then all around is so. What we have to see there is some of the lowest income people in England and Wales, and some of the highest income people in England and Wales, all within a ball bounce of each other. That's what we have in Norwich.
Phil?
You've got to work harder.
Just while on the topic of Eton, so the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership, Asher alluded to it earlier, has won some funding from central government to study the non-technical barriers to retrofitting, to transitioning. So it's broadly accepted that all of the technology, broadly speaking, exists to get us to net zero. But why aren't communities moving in that direction? And so each of the 8 local authorities in Norfolk has selected a community to study, and in the city we've decided that Eton should be that community, because there's the socio-economic conditions should be right for it. So what are the barriers? What's preventing that particular community from moving forward? And across the Norfolk, the local authorities across Norfolk, we've chosen quite intelligently, so we get a different story, a different insight from each community. So that's something we'll be starting to engage with in the next month or so.
they are one of the communities in this national lottery bid as well as the blue communities.
It could be that it's an ageing population and they don't feel that the investment they make will benefit them financially.
That is definitely part of it, and I've spoken to some of the the Eton Eco Church people.
Interesting.
think
Thank you.
we've had an hour of questions, that long
Yes,
presentation,
yes,
so
I have a
maybe
childcare
that's
hour.
a good point to wrap it up. That's thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
and of course,
Very
email, phone, if there's follow-up questions or things that you think I should be thinking about or the Commission should be thinking about. So thank you for the opportunity to come in.
No, not at all, and hopefully you can join us again one day, one other commissioner. I know Anthony came to, the first seat by chair, that must have been a couple of years ago, so that's quite a lot you've had to cover in
absolutely.
one
Well,
session.
I certainly could do the risk assessment in detail, if that was something in, not maybe the next meeting, but a few meetings, because we've got all that data. I just put up a little bit here.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks ever so much. Sorry.
Thank you very much. No, not at all.
Fined by the school.
What's time? Do we need to? Naomi. Thank you.
Asha.
Well, the school you off the premises.
I don't forget it. So, Councillor Champion's talking to.
Shall we carry on, I think, in time? So, global and local impacts of climate.
So your presentation, I think your presentation is hidden below. Just at the end down. So yours should be one of those.
Great, thank you. I think I've recognised it.
I might change the name. Thanks.
Yeah, over to you, Phil.
Shall I make a start? We're going to be covering some pretty similar information and data that Asha has provided. Actually, this is being played to you as council position. There's a subtle difference between the two. Asha can come here and say whatever he likes. What I'm going to present is, formally agreed at certainly officer level, and this is being used as a briefing to underpin and inform the various strategies that we're in the process of developing. And at the end of this presentation, I'll just bring us back to, what does our environmental programme look like, and what are the various kind of strands of that, and give a little update on where we are with that development work. How's that sound? So I've developed this briefing. Let me refer to my notes as well. As I say, it's really twofold. It informs strategy development, but it's making sure that everybody in the organisation has had a briefing on the causes of climate change, that we're all on the same page. So we understand the science of climate change, what the projections are, because my job is not only to propose strategies and plans, that's quite a piece of work in itself, but the more important bit is to bring the entire organisation along with those plans, so that when they are adopted, we hit the ground running and they will be implemented. So two distinct pieces of work, and this slide deck is a really important part of starting that journey off. I just want to focus on the two graphics that we're using across a lot of our media now. The blue to red stripes, the temperature stripes, represent temperature rise in Norwich between 1884 and 2022, and each stripe is a year, so really visually impactful signal that there is, undoubtedly a warming going on, just in case there are any sceptics left. And the biodiversity stripes, we'll come on to them a little bit later, represent global biodiversity loss from a WWF report. And rather alarmingly, they're from between 1970 and in 2018, but we'll come on to those. I won't spend long on the contents because we will just get on with it. An important part of the briefing, I just want to make sure everybody understands the greenhouse effect, what's driving this, because I think if everybody has a first principles understanding of what's bringing about climate change, then it makes people more effective. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes going through these, if I may. So if you've ever stood in a greenhouse on a cool day and the sun's out, it's warmer in there than outside. And why is this? And it's because glass has a very particular property that it lets ultraviolet light from the sun pass through it. And that ultraviolet light passes through the glass and starts warming up the floor and the plants and everything inside the greenhouse. But the important bit is that that heat is then radiated as infrared, and glass blocks infrared, so there is a net heating effect going on, and it's called the greenhouse effect. But unfortunately for us, our climate, our atmosphere behaves in exactly the same way. And the gases of industrialisation, we're all familiar with carbon dioxide, but we started to touch on some others earlier, some of those tailpipe emissions, refrigerant gases. The gases that we've been emitting since we industrialised improve the atmosphere's retaining and blocking properties for infrared, and so it's bringing about the same net heating effect. It's very measurable. In fact, the little green box there shows that it can be measured as increasing daily, and I think that brings a sense of urgency. You know, this isn't something that clicks up every year, it's going up all the time. And as we get to figure 3, we can see that there's all sorts of places that we're measuring this effect. It's not just in one place, and some of those show a much greater yearly variation. Some of them are more constant, and it really depends where those monitoring stations are. But we're seeing a distinct straight line increase in carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And figure 4 shows the corresponding temperature rise from around the time that we industrialised to the present time. And broadly speaking, we've seen about a degree of temperature rise since we started to industrialise. So a nice cause and effect. The science now is very robust. Where do these emissions, where have they historically come from? And surprisingly difficult to get really good data on this, but I guess what I'm trying to debunk here is that it isn't just India and China. That's a very common thing. Why should we do that? It's a common sort of argument that says, why should we do this if all the emissions coming from the newly developing nations? And that simply isn't true at all. If the UK was shown in here, we appear in the EU 28, because this graphic is actually from before we came out of Europe. I suspect, and if it was shown on a per capita basis, that the UK is probably, if not the highest historic emitter, certainly one of the highest. So, for me at least, we sort of morally have a position as really significant emitters of greenhouse gases to do our bit to reduce them. But certainly America is up there, Europe, and all countries now that have industrialised are emitting pretty significantly. The next slide shows the global, international, global political response so far. Interestingly, some of the smaller nations there have achieved net zero. But we're one of the few countries in the world that have it in law, and we'll come to that law in a moment. Many countries have it in policy documents or have made pledges. In fact, there's about 195 countries that are signed up, that are signatories to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is a really important organisation in that they have a means of generating scientific data upon which there's an international consensus, and we'll come to some of that information soon. So I think the takeaway from this is we're in a good place in the UK. We have significantly contributed to climate change, but we've also moved quickly and created law to get us on a decarbonisation pathway. And we'll look at what that pathway is and how it relates to the council's corporate climate change targets and city-wide activity as well. So much of the information on the next few slides is taken from the IPCC's report, published March this year, catchily entitled AR6, and it's a summary of lots of research that's been done, and it's a summary for policymakers, which of course we are at the council. And the question that the scientists are looking at is, how much warming and what are the scenarios for warming? And we learned from the Paris Agreement, which took place made in 2015, that we need to limit warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees C. But scientists are looking at greater warming scenarios, and they call them, the scenarios known as the shared socio-economic pathways. And broadly speaking, there's 5 of them. I'm just touching a little bit on climate science here. We don't need to know the detail, but SSP 1 to 1.9 is that low emission scenario. It's keeping things below 2 degrees, and 5 to 8.5 is a strong warming scenario where greenhouse gases triple by 2075. So it's best case to worst case scenario. But importantly here, the current pledges and laws and commitments made internationally are predicted to take warming to around 3 degrees. And the reason that's important for us in the city is that it suggests that no matter, of course we have to do our bit, and we'll talk about what that looks like, but it's very likely that unless the international response strengthens, that we will need to use that sort of degree of warming in our adaptation and resilience planning. The AR6 report sets out some really quite accessible graphics, and we can see there the warming that's taken place since 1900 in those temperature stripes, and then into 5 scenarios looking forward that relate to the 5 shared socioeconomic pathways. And only in the 2 lowest warming scenarios do we bring warming to a halt this century. The 3 higher scenarios continue warming beyond the end of the century. So what we're seeing here is a real imperative to subscribe to policies, strategies and plans that keep the warming to that 1 to 1.9 degrees. And the graphics go on to express what the perils are, I'm going to say, of warming beyond the 1.5 to 2 degrees. And I like them because they're very accessible, and they give us a pretty clear vision that at 4 degrees, we can see there, that many parts of the world, their hottest day annual temperatures are 7 degrees hotter than today. And so, having had 40-degree summer in very recent memory, we can see that that's likely to be going to 45 to perhaps 50 degrees. And I think regionally, we're predicted to have a 40-degree summer every other summer or thereabouts by 2050. So temperature increase and heat stress is something we're all familiar with, I think, the notion of it. We then move on to heat stress and human health. And we don't need to go into the detail of these, but we can see there parts of the globe where there's a heat and humidity risk to human health, according to the number of days of the year that risk exists. And that equatorial zone really starts to look pretty uninhabitable in the strong warming scenario. And for me, and Asha started to touch on this, this is a proxy for migration. People in those parts of the world, and it's very likely that this is already a driver of migration at the moment, will have to go north or south. And so it indicates the significant disruption globally that climate change is likely, unless we can get it under control, to bring about. Soil moisture is not something I'm particularly familiar with. I wish Asher was here. He's an ecologist. He'd be able to answer that one, so I'm not going to talk to it in any detail. Wettest day precipitation, rain, we can see that the predictions are for some parts of the globe to have 40% higher rain events, and Asher alluded to these as we're familiar that we've seen on the news, on the telly, that there have been some really significant downpours in all parts of the world, not just in regions that are prone to typhoons, but we've seen it in Spain, we saw one in Germany a couple of years ago. So rain, or alluvial flooding, as it's known, as I've learned recently, is one of the risks that we need to be considering. And biodiversity loss is pretty much the last of these graphics. And again, we can see in those equatorial regions that it's pretty catastrophic. In the strong warming scenario, the 4 degrees, there's really significant risk of loss of species. And of course, we saw this with human health. And of course, we are a species too. So, what we're sort of expressing here is the absolute need to maintain our emissions reduction on a pathway to remain below 2 degrees. We touched on sea level rise. It's probably one of the harder things to predict, because we just don't know. We don't have the detailed science that predicts the rate of ice loss, and it's Greenland and West Antarctic apparently are the 2 big ice sheets that really contribute to sea level rise. But the IPCC is certainly, the consensus seems to be around 0.5 metre to 1 metre by 2100. Doesn't sound a lot, but there's a lot of coastal communities around the world who are very vulnerable to sea level rise. And what we do know is that there's already enough carbon in the atmosphere to drive that sea level rise for some time. But slowing our emissions, reducing emissions, does slow the rate of increase. So it's all to play for. And some takeaway statements from that report are the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impact now and for thousands of years. We're really at a turning point, I take from that. Approximately 3.5 billion people are highly vulnerable to climate change globally, which suggests that a transition, has to be just. It has to be. It's not just about the local impacts. And all global modelled pathways that limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees C involve rapid and deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that's the sort of the signals that we're taking away from that report in March. And it's the Council's position that we very much accept this data, and it is informing the development of policies, strategies and plans as we speak. I just want to touch on biodiversity loss. A report 2022 from WWF shows that across the species that they monitor, they're kind of indicator species, and I think I can see there's kind of 5,000 species in various parts of the world. They've quite depressingly seen nearly a 70% reduction in there's a really significant loss of biodiversity going on globally, and we have similar, perhaps not quite so bad biodiversity loss in the UK, with about, I think I'm right in saying that roughly half of species are in decline over the last 5 years, but the signal is unequivocal. it's something that we in the case of biodiversity, have acted on. We have a biodiversity strategy.
Can I just ask, is that just biodiversity or biomass? When you're talking about, like, so you lose species, but there's been a decline in species, and so there's less of specific species. Is that something which is...
I'd be happy to get back to you on the specifics of it. So you're absolutely right in how biodiversity is measured is quite complex. Actually, what I might do is read off of this, because it would, if my eyes were better. So the average change in relative abundance of nearly 32,000 populations, representing just over 5,000 species monitored across the globe. So it's abundance. So we're not necessarily measuring extinction there, although we know that we are in an extinction event, but it's the abundance of those species.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't read it either.
So let's talk about the UK government response, and some of this is well known and some of it is less well known. So I think we were the first nation to set out a Climate Change Act in 2008, and the original target was for 80% of our CO2 emissions to be reduced by 2050. It was an 80% target compared to 1990. But as the science has evolved and become more credible, in 2019, the government amended the target to 100% of our emissions by 2050. So we're in a good place. We have some pretty robust statutory instruments and laws in place. But what's less well known about is the carbon budgeting process that's also in law. We're currently in the 6th carbon budget period, and the Carbon Budget Order of 2021 sets out a target of a 78% reduction by 2035. And I think there was a hoo-ha. Was it Zach Goldsmith resigned? And the reason he gave for resigning was actually this departure that we've started to see in our progress here. So he was citing the 6th carbon budget as not being adhered to, and what it does is it sets an absolute carbon budget for the UK for 2035, averaged across sectors. See, there's probably a very large number, 965 million tonnes. But
sorry, the dotted line is what we're on. Then that's where we're.
Yes.
What's happening? Okay.
Exactly. And what you're seeing here is a less well publicised set of legislative instruments that define the UK's pathway to remaining between 1.5 to 2 degrees. So the UK does have in law a 1.5 to 2 degree carbon reduction pathway, and that's a really useful signal, because we can use that in our policy and strategy and planning, and we are. So that's the UK government response. And what I want to do now is just look at some of some more local information. Ash has started to talk around some of this, and Amanda, I think we spoke. I said, hang on a second, we'll come back to that. So, figure 1 is on Norwich's territorial emissions. So what we're looking at here is emissions from commerce, industry, public sector, domestic transport, and land-based emissions. And I think so. This is to 2020 from 2005. It's pretty interesting stuff. And I'll just talk around what's pertinent about it. First off, in an uncoordinated but combined effort, Norwich's emissions, according to this definition of scope, have reduced by over 50% despite a 12% increase in population. And I'm heartened by that. And if you draw a trend line actually across that top line, the total emissions, it does point towards a net zeroing at 2030. I'm not saying that it is going to, but that's the current trend. But there's a difference between the journey so far and the journey ahead. The journey so far has broadly been supported by the investments having a good payback. There's a good business case for this early energy efficiency work that all sectors in the city have been undertaking. The journey ahead is less supported, it's a little bit more expensive, so this is where green finance, and there's all sorts of mechanisms by which we need to promote this next part of the journey, but what we've done so far is pretty good. What's particularly sticky there is the domestic sector and transport, and again, Asher alluded to that. And the reductions that we've seen in domestic has been driven by, it's really the improvement in the carbon performance of our electricity as a country, because we've had a fantastic success story in developing lots of renewables.
Sorry, what colours are they? Because my
Right.
eyes aren't good enough
Yeah,
to
yeah.
see.
Let's
Isn't it?
Let's do
Sorry.
it.
You'll all get a copy of the slides.
All right.
Yes.
So
We'll put it online.
industry,
Yeah.
commerce, public sector, domestic, transport and land use. You know, if we were a rural community, it would be huge, but it's a tiny little line on the
Yeah, I
top
can't
of
see
that
that,
graph. And you know, this is good data. It's from, they were Bays at the time, they're called DENS now, the government department, and we receive it every year. So we're off to a good start. With figure 2, what's important to understand, we're all used to seeing graphs go down. But every year we produce carbon dioxide, it goes into the atmosphere and stays there. So it's actually accumulating every year. And what net zero is a flattening off of this line so that there's no net increase in emissions over time. Asher alluded to that. That's our target, is to flatten that line. And the data shows us also in figure 3 here that 96% of these territorial emissions from all of those things we've just seen, those sectors, are from fossil fuels. A very small amount is from waste, and really an immeasurably small amount, it's less than 1%, or it's tiny, is from land use. So from a city perspective, decarbonisation is actually a defossilization. It's coming out of fossil fuels. There's still other emissions that come from people's consumption. You know, interestingly, when we saw China's emissions, you know, for a lot of years, China's emissions were the West's Scope 3 emissions. They're the result of our consumption. So there's
We still don't account for those in our carbon budget as the UK, do we? Our offshoring of our emissions.
So we do have some data sets, and Asher was drawing on, when he said we're 7 tonnes,
Okay.
that is looking at everything. But it's harder to estimate. But yes, they are in our thinking as a council. They have to be. We can influence things like transport, retrofitting. We can influence those more strongly. And the way people consume is a softer approach for us. We obviously have, you know, our ability to do that is less. It becomes more of a communications and engagement thing. But we're starting to see some data on that. So that 6th carbon budget. So, you know, what we've seen is the UK government has a mechanism for setting a carbon budget for the UK. And one of the things that the Tyndall Centre has done is it's sub-aggregated it, it's sub-allocated it, I should say, down to city levels. But there are different methodologies for doing this. We're now into the nitty-gritty of what we actually need as a city in the near future. And this is something that we will will come through in our city-wide climate action plan. What is a fair apportioning of that national budget down to the city level? How do we apportion it fairly on the actual emitters in the city rather than those people who are already in deprivation and therefore low emitters? And I've got a couple of slides on the relationship between emissions and we have to be going in to have a city-wide target and to understand what we're all aiming for. But I think that's this particular methodology needs further consideration. Let's put it that way. And that's something that we will work on. So Asher showed some information around this too. We've got some pretty good carbon data on a ward basis, even more granular than that. And it absolutely does show that the more affluent parts of the city are the higher emitters. And of course we need to, it alludes to a ward by ward climate action strategy and plan where we're placing an obligation on the wealthier people in the city to do the heavier lifting when it comes to decarbonisation. Absolutely mustn't obligate those in greater deprivation and exacerbate that. And yes, we are below the national average when it comes to emissions because of the socio-economic conditions in the city. And so that needs to be reflected in that targeting system that we need to develop, where we're heading. I did a slide on the impact of fossil fuel consumption. And we mentioned earlier that really this is an exercise in defossilization. And what I've done is I've taken the carbon data, which has energy data sat behind it, and I've added the cost of energy, which is a pretty straightforward exercise, and the cost of petrol and diesel as it was in August, I think, when I did this, and to give us some idea of the rate of the extraction of community wealth by the fossil fuel industry. And of course, at the moment, fossil fuels are very embedded. But what I think the vision is as we go forward, there's greater emphasis on community renewable energy assets are paid for by savings in fossil fuels. So these are solar panels on people's roofs. And importantly, not only are they driving successful decarbonisation, but they're also releasing people from, I want to say, from the grip of the fossil fuel industry to a degree. We saw the terrible inflation in fossil fuels last year, and that's driven some really critical living conditions. So we're very much looking to understand how we can defossilise, generate community ownership of renewable energy systems. That's something we're going to be leading on. But to return to the slide, 361 million quid per year that we could be using to, we could be saving, using to invest in renewable energy assets. And when you start to look at things like the social cost of carbon, we're starting to see some interesting information that looks at the health costs of fossil fuels and the wider cost of having to adapt to climate change. That's a pretty significant chunk of cash going over the city boundary every year that we can retain as we develop out renewable energy. I brought this here many times. It's just a quick reminder that as a local authority, our progress on decarbonisation is good. Yes, of course, we're holding the 2030 net zero target, and actually, that's very safely a 1.5 to 2 degree pathway. So we're putting some detail into how we get there.
So just for clarity,
yes,
and I know this is obvious, but people who might be watching, that graph refers to the councils.
Yes,
it does just to the council, whereas Asher was talking about Norwich in a fuller context.
Yes, and that's what we saw So I did the cities one earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, you're right.
Okay, I just wanted to contextualise.
No, that's
okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
So the councils are and we've had this formally audited by specialist carbon auditors. We're 66% reduction since our baseline. And the city was 52% reduction since its baseline. So, strong progress. As we say, the way forward now needs some pretty careful strategizing and planning. And just a reminder of what's coming actually to the next scene. The structure of our environmental programme. We decided that although we have an environmental strategy in place, the Council's environmental strategy 2020 to 2025, that the science and the solutions have moved so quickly in the last 2 or 3 years that we've decided to refresh and increase the scope of our environmental programme. So the existing environmental strategy provides a great foundation to build on. It talks about citywide, it talks about all of the right things. But at that time, there wasn't sufficient evidence to put the detail in it. So we have drafted an environmental emergency response programme. The document's written, it's currently going through officers, it'll be coming to members, but that sets out more detail than the existing strategy. It's pretty comprehensive, it's fully comprehensive. And in that there are policies and commitments, what we'll do and by when, supported by the evidence base that we have. And it broadly has 3 work streams. It has a biodiversity strategy, which is already up and running, but it's brought into the programme to make sure that we can manage the opportunities that exist between biodiversity and climate action. They're 2 very closely related work streams. It has a citywide climate action strategy and plan, which includes greenhouse gas mitigation, reduction by another name, and adaptation and resilience. And we have a Norwich City Council climate action strategy and plan that broadly falls into a plan for our general operations and a plan for our housing operations. So this is all pretty advanced. We'll be consulting on it very soon. It's written. And I just wanted to say that sustainable warmth strategy, which we adopted last year, is there to ensure that whatever we do in the climate action space doesn't exacerbate fuel poverty, as we were just talking about. So it all hangs together pretty nicely. So yes, the detail of these of the programme and its work streams is being poured over right now. And the other evidence that we've drawn on is the carbon auditors have looked at all of our emissions right across the organisation. We've currently been reporting on a subset of our carbon emissions. They've looked at everything we procure, all of our capital works. We've looked at the carbon emissions from our social housing, and not all of that is going to be net zero 2030. For example, social housing is a big old estate. But we have the government's targets as guide to us, and yeah, we've had a really comprehensive measurement of every way that we impact the climate, and they will all be included in our strategies and plans. I think that's the end of my presentation. There's a bit of phraseology that comes at the end there, just in case that's useful when you go through it.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I saw Councillor Champion and Councillor Fox.
Sorry, I'm quick off the mark. I've learned. There's been lots of meetings where I hold off, waiting, and then listen. So the report you were just saying about, and that refers to adaptation. So that's going to be that report will show us how we're going to adapt to a 3-degree increased temperature.
So adaptation is in our work plan.
Okay.
What comes first is the detailed plans on how we reduce emissions. So the environmental programme document will set out a work plan for all of those subsections, everything that we need to publish. And we're moving first on carbon reduction.
So can I just to go back to the beginning of the slides, and I mean, I'm a geography teacher. And I always get kids asking me, so why, if it's going to do this, why aren't you planning and making a plan?
To answer your question in short, yes, the adaptation and resilience plan is certainly being informed by this. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the purpose of this early piece of work.
Okay. Thank you.
And I just want to say, at the point at which we publish a strategy and plan, the work has been ongoing for perhaps 2 or 3 years before. It's a consolidation at that point. So, as we spoke about during Ash's session, we're flood modelling now. That's all underway. It's not waiting until we actually publish it to start the work. There's lots going on there now.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Fox.
Well, first of all, Phil, thanks, because it was really, really refreshing to see the facts so accurately represented.
Thank you.
With where policies take us to at the moment, which is between 2.8 and 3.1 degrees, looking at the surface of the planet that is essentially going to be pretty uninhabitable, there's going to be a huge amount of migration from that, and also massive areas that currently produce food that won't be able to produce food, so there's going to be lots of the world's population living in conditions of famine, which inevitably causes conflict. I'm really curious how you adapt for mass conflict, mass famine, mass migration, and like the World Health Organization has made these predictions of 5 million climate deaths by 2050, but between 2030 and 2050. For me, I know we need to adapt. I don't know how you adapt to protect yourself against the level of global destabilisation that would cause, for one thing. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is with our carbon reduction. I'd put about the carbon budget, the 78% reduction in carbon budget. Are we on target with that 78%? How much of that are we on target for, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Thank you. So,
and also, how much will that cost?
Yes, yes. Let me take those points. So at the moment, we are we're at an early stage as a global community in waking up to this data at a policy maker level and working out how we adapt. So I think there's been really good work done on mitigation, on reducing emissions, but we've done less on adaptation. So there's an awful lot to work through and work out. And most of those answers are currently unanswerable. But I feel that there's 2 really important kind of principles here that can guide us locally. The first is that as an organisation, we pretty much have to think and do things very differently from now on. There's a culture piece, which is we, rather than doing as we've always done, we now stop and think, and we consider from first principles pretty much everything we do, and how can we reduce our emissions by doing it differently, and how can we adapt in the way that we do that. So there is a kind of, and the second kind of general principle is around localism. You know, it's how can we optimise our local environment, the city, to improve food production, as you've spoken about. You know, we have to consider the impact globally, but also we have to consider what we can do within our city boundary, the area that we notionally have some control over, that we can influence and we can engage with, to absolutely optimise what we do here in the city. So I think that there are two principles. On the matter of cost, you know, it's going to take more work to understand cost. And if we just narrow down into one of the elements of cost around retrofitting of buildings, we have engaged with central government on some funding, and we're doing some retrofitting projects in the city. And yes, the numbers are relatively small in terms of that, the number of dwellings that we're treating. But the learning experience has been incredibly valuable. We now know what it does cost to get a dwelling that might be an EPC of E to C, for example, and we're starting to get the information that allows us to really, in detail, model the costs of certainly domestically getting all buildings in the city from where they currently are on the EPC scale to where we need to get them. It's enormous. It's enormous. So yes, we're a way off of having, you know, those cost predictions. It's billions in terms of retrofitting domestically, but we're understanding how we can model that cost and you know, create an evidence base for the need for support, whether it's from you know, green finance providers or whether it's from central government. It's getting to that place where we have a good understanding of what the costs are, then we can start to consider where the money comes from.
Councillor Champion?
I was fortunate enough to be one of the people who applied to the City Council to get government funding by E.ON. The process was abysmal. It was one of the worst processes I've ever encountered. It seemed that the council's communication with E.ON was flaggy. It seemed like E.ON's communication with its subcontractors was iffy. And I've spoken anecdotally to a lot of people who had similar experience. I presume that funding was an individual funding pot that we've now used, because I understand that is no longer available. And by the time people have found out about it, the opportunity has passed. And one of my concerns about that entire process was the poor communication. The poor communication within the council itself. I think even communicating it to itself, I had to have somebody outside the council telling me that this was occurring, and maybe that was me missing a memo. And then our communication to the wider public. And so I'm wondering, have we got more funding streams coming up to allow people to continue access to retrofitting and advice in relation to the retrofitting funding which is available? I've forgotten the name now.
Sustainable warmth competition?
No, there's there is government funding available. People can apply to directly.
There's Eco4, Great British Insulation Scheme.
But they give you the lowest form of insulation that you then have to replace within probably a decade. And it strikes me as inherently unsustainable that you're going to, a lot of people, you know, my house hasn't been re-insulated since, you know, whenever. Because once people have got insulation, they don't then think about re-insulating. And so, can we up the bar on the level of insulation that is being offered so that people aren't forced into or the council has to start you know, it's going to be like painting the Severn Bridge. If all these houses which are retrofitting now, and I know that we're celebrating the council and well done, but by the time we finish, we're going to need to start again. And have we addressed that? Have we got a plan for that?
So, on the matter of privately owned dwellings, so social housing, one thing, because that's within our budgetary management and control. with regards to other tenures, so owner-occupied, private rented sector, the council cannot fund that. It would be, I'm sure there's a policy that relates to this, but on very simple terms, it would be unfair to use council taxpayers' money to insulate people's homes. We're just not constitutionally set up to do that. So we are wholly reliant on government grant schemes. And the Sustainable Warmth Competition, to answer your question specifically, there hasn't been a second round announced. I would like to think that there would be. We have got other schemes, albeit they're very sort of minimum schemes. And, for me, that's just part of a pretty, talking personally now, a woeful lack of response from central government as to what is, clearly a very significant emergency, both we're talking climate but biodiversity as well. So yes, we cannot support financially the insulating of people's homes, but what we can do is signpost them to those grant schemes. And I'm sorry to hear of your difficult experience. One of the many complexities of that grant scheme was initially, firstly, it had to be spent within 12 months. And so to procure, mobilise, do communications, do the work, go through the process of then satisfying the funding departments that it's all been done in 12 months was with hindsight, never going to be possible. So we had to move very quickly, and the way that we chose to do that was through a series of letter drops to people that are in the right EPC bands that met the funding requirements. But GDPR rules meant that we couldn't put people's names and addresses on them, so they had a letter drop that said E.ON, but it also had Norwich City Council. But what we found was, and it's important feedback, was that people just didn't believe that it was free. And so we had very slow take-up, but as soon as you've got some scaffolding up and the work's being done, there's a sudden rush. At that point, the scheme is full, or it's becoming full. And we've had other barriers. Another really significant issue has been a new regulation in retrofitting, which was brought in quite rightly after Grenfell Tower, and there have been other retrofitting issues. And it requires a whole house approach. And now something that used to be very simple, loft insulation, it's easy to do, now requires a whole house ventilation strategy that requires people have all of their internal doors so that they have a 10mm gap under them. So we've been knocking on doors saying, would you like loft insulation? Yes, please. Oh, we've got to do all your doors. So, no, we don't want that done. So there's been a bit of a knee-jerk reaction post-Grenfell with a standard that has limited uptake to some degree. But rest assured, there are good quality feedback mechanisms that mean that this can all be fed back. And the next round of funding, when I hope that comes soon, will incorporate those learning experiences. And we actually know government really does listen, because the first round of social housing decarb was a year. The similar kind of utter, it's really difficult to deliver it in that time. And the next round came out as a 2-year programme. So we're seeing central government respond to some of those issues.
Thank you.
No,
Good answer.
Councillor Fox.
With the science that you sort of presented, do you feel like, because I don't think that lots of people in Norwich sort of perhaps realise quite that we're on this track for 2.8 to 3.1 with current policies. I think most people kind of think that, people are taking care of this, to some degree. And so are we being negligent by not communicating that well enough to the people who we represent? not in an alarmist way, but in a, we've got to do this super, super fast. This is where we currently are at.
Yep.
And there's this massive gap between where we're at and where we need to be. And yeah, are we kind of being negligent in not telling people the truth, I guess, is what I'm asking. And yeah, one other thing, it's not going to come as a surprise to anybody here that I'm going to ask about this, I don't think. But with the tier 3 emissions, as I understand it, when it comes to finance for the council, as far as I understand it, tier 3 only takes into account like our banking, their operational emissions. It doesn't take into account what they do with that money. So, you know,
it does.
It does. So
Yeah.
that it takes into account that as
Yeah,
well.
investments
So
are
with
in
tier,
tier
so if we're taking tier 3
Yeah.
into account, we wouldn't be able to bank with a bank that is massively funding fossil fuels, the worst fossil fuel funder in Europe.
So it certainly starts a dialogue about how we procure and how we reduce the emissions from the goods and services and capital works that we procure. So I think it would be wrong of me to say any more than that at the moment, but that discussion around how we ensure the values of our values are reflected in those that we buy goods and services from over time. So there's a procurement strategy that is, you know, this work is informing the sustainable element of a procurement strategy, and that discussion fits there. So.
I've got to go, but can I just say thank you very, very much. It's been a very good meeting. And will you be circulating these now?
Yes,
Yes, I will do. And they'll
To
be on the
all
website.
councillors?
I think we're getting to the point where there
I
is.
can put them on e-councillor.
Yeah.
If it feels happy with that.
Because as you say,
Go up to
to
minutes.
understand first principles, which you've
And
got
they'll be
there
on the
is-
website then. That's okay for you? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where's it going to be?
It'll be on the website, so
On the
I'll make sure that you all know when I put that on.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Stutley?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just a quick question, I think, because probably want to wrap up now. We had another scrutiny meeting earlier this year where we discussed green financing and the possibilities globally and
Discuss green
finance initiatives, and there were a number of different options. I just wondered whether there had been any progress on that, whether you had discovered anything that the Norwich City Council can access for its own programme of retrofitting, but also those, because the schemes that Councillor Champion talked about, and I also had a look at myself, are open to people on lower incomes. I wondered if there's any progress on financing opportunities for people who have higher incomes, but also just don't retrofit their homes because financially they don't need to, but it would be a good idea if they did.
I mean, we're certainly seeing finance as one of the main non-technical barriers. So we've stayed in touch with the Green Finance Institute, and what we hear, the update is that we are informed that 2 or 3 really major mortgage lenders are almost at the point of offering products that stay with the house even after it's sold. So it feels as though this really important part of that jigsaw is moving forward, but nothing in the public domain yet. But that's how we're. I mean, it's such a huge opportunity to lend money. If we do believe in free market economics, it suggests that somebody's got to finance some of this stuff. So yes, I really do. I'm really hopeful that it's going to happen. So yeah, we'll let you know as soon as we get an update.
Thank you. There is some encouragement there because yes, I think it is that opportunity for people who can afford to borrow money, and if they borrow against the house across the life, it's very long-term lending, isn't it? And,
Exactly.
And therefore, a cheap way of doing it, very more affordable.
And in our citywide climate action plan, finance is, it's there for, it's there as one of the main tenets of that strategy to be developed out. And I should also probably add that I've made put together a proposal to increase the pretty significant increase in the number of staff in my team, and one of those will be a citywide climate action coordinator who will lead that climate action plan. So it's really good practice as an organisation to set out what you're going to do and then recruit the people to actually deliver that. That's good value for money, and those people can hit the ground running. So that process is following through.
Can I just make a comment on that? And actually, one of the most important things that I didn't mention was that that type of financing against a property would open up the opportunities to more people, I would hope, because therefore you wouldn't need the status. If it goes with a property, you wouldn't necessarily need the status that you'd normally need for borrowing money,
because it's leveraged on the value of the property. Yeah, quite.
Councillor Fox, Councillor Champion.
On the, like when we looked at the chart of Norwich, it was, the poorest areas were doing the best kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if there's any way of rewarding people that are doing well, and whether that's something that's been looked at all, because then it would perhaps help with that and change that dynamic from sort of, some wealthy people not doing so much to, if there was, well, we can't do like carbon coin, but you know what I mean, something along those lines. And what was the other point? There's another point. Wherever it is gone.
That's okay. So, I mean, a fair and just transition is really key. So we hadn't considered the reward of transitioning to renewable energy is that it fixes the price of energy over the life of the asset, which is often 25 to 30 years for a solar panel system. It removes people from that kind of I was going to say boom and bust, but the price increase, the risk of price increases that we've seen last year. But I take that on as a thought. Is there some way that we can certainly at least credit people in those less well-off wards as doing their bit for the climate, but we also need to be really careful because there's some people living in some very critical living conditions, and we mustn't, phrase their experience as in any way sort of something to aim for or desirable. We've both got to lift them out of those living conditions, or enable them to do that, and yes, obligate the people who can afford to meet their own cost of transitioning, do that also.
I just remembered what the other point was, if that's okay. It was just with the thing that you said about with Gary's situation, where it was sort of you had the information, but then by the time you're able to get to it, it was kind of over. I wondered if you had any ideas about how, because bureaucratic systems can be quite slow, can't they? And it's really difficult sometimes to keep up with the latest information, with like action and information to match, I suppose. So I wondered if you had any ideas for how to make the system more agile for when new information comes out, I guess.
What, for targeting people who might benefit from grant schemes specifically?
Not specifically that, but that's a good example. But yeah, how to be more agile so that when we have information, action can follow really quickly behind.
Yeah, I think we have become now really quite. This is about experience, So in this particular example, retrofitting, there's so much to learn. There's about standard and how you apply it, what experts you need to help you interpret the rules and regulations. There's the local retrofitting market, how you find people. It's just a whole expertise in itself. And although we've probably retrofitted maybe about 45 council houses and a couple of hundred or more of private. The learning experience from that has been the greatest value. So I think the answer is it's becoming experienced. And then retaining that experience and knowledge, in the organisation. So when the next round comes, you know how to do it, and you can fine tune it and improve things. That's what we've been learning. Yeah. Yes.
I have Councillor Champion, and then unless there are any other pressing questions, I suggest we wrap up. But go on.
I think we should have these meetings earlier in the day to allow more time to discuss the most pressing issue in the contemporary world. To be honest, I don't think it should be an add-on. But
I'd bear in mind that a lot of our group, they have day jobs as well. This is, if anything,
I've got a day job up. I reduced my hours significantly to allow me to do this job. I only say that because it concerns me that we meet very infrequently. I appreciate the information is then passed on to Cabinet. And I appreciate the work that you're doing and the work that you're doing. It is admirable. But I just, I think we should have more frequent meetings, and I think we should allow more time for a discussion, just to put it out there and just saying my point. But my question is in relation to renters. It strikes me that actually, if we're going to talk about climate justice, actually people in council housing, people in social housing, people who are home occupiers, they all seem to have been addressed as far as I can tell. But from what I can observe, people who are renting are the people losing out because they have got least access to insulation and they are most subject to price increases. And so therefore, they've got no incentive to do it. Have we got a method to address that particular aspect of Norwich's population?
So I think certainly the government does. I absolutely agree that private rented sectors has been really hard to treat. And that's not least because the people suffering from the poor living conditions aren't the people who own the properties. Obviously, there's a real divide there, and the incentives so far haven't. We haven't seen much movement in retrofitting of private rented. It just hasn't worked. In fact, if anything, we've seen landlords selling houses rather than meeting their minimum requirements, which sort of exacerbates the availability of housing. So the government's approach to that is, we have something called the Great British Insulation Scheme, we have something called Eco4, but do they go far enough? Time will tell, but I can only agree that that's a particularly thorny sector of housing to get at, and yes, it's something we need to focus on as part of the citywide strategy.
I'll just come in on that quickly. I think the green financing options for house-related lending could actually address that if the incentives were there, or in fact the requirements were there for private landlords to improve their properties. So combine the two, and that is a solution.
Carrot and stick.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And also, just to address your other point, there's a scrutiny task and finish group underway at the moment that we're looking at retrofitting, so there'll be a lot more detail on that and an opportunity for council-wide discussion, I believe.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Councillor Oliver.
It's a question, but it might be a rhetorical question, but given that county councils unilaterally decide to reopen Exchange Street, so there'll be some more cars going down there, how much are we able to have full control over our climate mitigations?
Around transport?
Yeah, especially, but for another day.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, very, very short answer is, of course, county have that in their portfolio, but we do engage. There is a really active working group. We're about to see a really significant portion of our buses electrified, nearing 50-60%. So the county is shifting too, I think. the possible takeaway from that. And their climate act strategy is actually really very good. So I think they are in the wake-up process to the evidence as well.
Right, thank you very much. I think we'll draw that one to a close. As you say, the programme itself will come through to this meeting, so some of these details can be picked up again then. But otherwise, thank you very much. It was a really good presentation and a set of questions and answers. So I'll close the meeting.
Yeah,
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Emma, for chairing so well.